Let's say good morning to our first guest, Delegate Larry Kump, Republican out of the 94th. Larry, good morning. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning, and for sure and for certain, may God bless you all real good.
Thank you, sir. How well did you know Mayor Karros?
I knew him fairly well. He was quite a gentleman. He'll be missed. He is missed.
Yeah, did you have an opportunity to work with him at all in any way?
A little bit. There was some issues that was tangential and some things we were concerned with the legislature, and he was upfront, transparent about everything, and an absolute gentleman.
Well, thank you. Appreciate those thoughts, Larry. And some thoughts from you in regards to some things that have transpired recently out of the governor's desk, his office, and his decision with the legislative oversight bill to let it become law without a signature. This is legislative oversight of the Board of Education in the state of West Virginia. You have a theory.
Well, I do. Now, full disclosure, I've known Patrick Morrissey since 2010. Him and I are friends, and I'm a big supporter. However, I don't pretend to know what's going through his mind. But as many may know, the governor let the education oversight bill become law, but without his signature. And I think there's some reasons behind that. Of course, there are reasons that I agree with. Let me back up a little bit. There's three essentially kinds of government orders. There's Constitution, which goes first and foremost. Then there's laws that the legislature passes. And then there's the rules and regulations that agencies promulgate. And rules and regulations cannot contradict legislative laws or the Constitution, and legislative laws cannot contradict the Constitution. My problem with the education oversight bill, which I agreed with in essence, I thought the Supreme Court, when they ruled that it was not constitutional for all the agencies that had legislative oversight for the Department of Education not to have them. And let me back up a little bit on that. West Virginia is kind of an outlier. Most states, whenever they pass a law, the agencies, by necessity, have to do rules to implement that law and to clarify some things. In most states, the Attorney General handles that. In West Virginia, it goes to the legislature, and they look at that to see if what rules were implemented by an agency are correct or not. We don't have that oversight in the Department of Education, and the Supreme Court says that it was unconstitutional for us to do that. Now, I don't agree with what the Supreme Court said, but then the legislature, and I thought this was also a good move, brought the constitutional issue to the citizens to amend the Constitution so it was appropriate for the legislature to oversight the Department of Education as well as the other agencies. I don't agree with what the citizens did. The citizens voted down that constitutional amendment. There are some reasons for that, I believe. One was the way it was written was very complicated and it confused people. Number two, the then Governor Justice was against it and the teachers union was against it, so it didn't pass. Even so, I think it was improper because one of the big things that we have as a constitutional guarantee, which is unique in our country, is we have separation of powers. The legislative branch has certain authority, the judicial branch has certain authority, and the executive branch has certain authority. I think by the legislature overruling a Supreme Court ruling and a referendum on the Constitution by the citizens erred, and that was a mistake procedurally. Now, the argument has been, well, maybe the Supreme Court will change their mind and say it's constitutional now since we have a different makeup of the Supreme Court. What I believe may happen is that could happen, but I think it's more likely for them to look at the procedure of what the legislature did rather than the merits. In other words, I think they might look into it and say the legislature erred, it's a violation of separation of powers, and I think that the Supreme Court may say, nope, that legislative law is invalid, not because of the merits of the case, but because they violated procedure. And I think that might be behind why the governor didn't want to stick his neck out and put his signature on the bill.
Because if it gets struck down by the court, he doesn't look as bad by not signing it?
Right.
So what happens? I mean, as of tomorrow, do they have oversight?
Currently under current law, they don't have oversight. They didn't before the current law, because.
But with the current law, I mean, does that have?
Well, the current law says
the new current law.
The new current law says they have oversight until and such time as the court says otherwise.
Okay.
And the court has not yet said that.
And the court has not yet said that.
Therefore, it is the law.
It is the law, for now.
See, that was a clear answer.
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, we now understand that that's the law until the court says.
Well, this is the complicated
when.
thing they do in the legislature is you throw out something that they know is not constitutional. You know it because you can read the Constitution.
Right.
And it just
Well,
becomes
you suspect.
You suspect.
You suspect.
But
it's very clear that the
but-
Constitution gives the.
But in that, no, it's not clear, and it wasn't clear when the Supreme Court made that ruling. So there's some argument about that. I don't agree with the Supreme Court ruling, but it is what it is. And then they went even a step further, and the legislature brought it to a referendum to amend the Constitution to make it clear. And I don't agree with the way the people voted. They voted to reject that. So there's the issue. So the Supreme Court is probably going to, hear it. And I think, and it was interesting to see the roll call, and I have a copy of it here, the legislators. Some of the committee chairmen understood the argument I made when I spoke against that bill, and they voted against it too. It still was enough votes for it to pass. And I just think that it was reckless and feckless the way the legislature did it. What the legislature should have done, in my opinion, is to just try again for a constitutional amendment. It would have passed, it would have gone to referendum, and we'd have been all right.
Yeah. Larry, you said the Constitution was not clear. The Constitution, I believe, is clear on this. It's just that the legislators are taking action that is contrary to the Constitution when they wanted to do a new constitutional amendment. Something has to be done with our education system, and Mike Hornby and I have talked about this many times off air, and he and I have two different views. My view is that I would like to see the legislators, and they have the authority to do this, to work with the Board of Education to do a fairly intense study to see what is not working and why it's not working. Something's not working. We have to do that. But having the legislators have oversight at this point in time makes it a partisan issue, especially the makeup of the legislators today being 95% of one party. That is subject to partisan whims. The turnover of the legislators also argue against consistency of opinion. So you could have one opinion 1 year, 2 years down the line, you give a different suite of directions to education. Education, more than anything else, needs stability. And legislators, the makeup of the legislators, do not provide that long-term stability. They look in terms of 2 years and not in terms of 5, 10, 15 years.
Well, I would agree in part. And one thing I will say, since all this hubbub started, the Department of Education has become more responsive to the legislature. It's still an issue. It is almost the only department in the state that doesn't have legislative oversight. I would disagree with the partisan nature of and I would agree that the state legislature is partisan, but I would disagree that the legislative review, which goes through by the Rules Committee and also the Government Organization Committee, is biased on a partisan basis. Because as I've sat on these hearings, it's been essentially, the argument has been, did what the agency do, was it in compliance with what we wanted the law to do? And that's as far as it went. It wasn't political, partisan in that nature.
Well, there's been some language recently that deals with education that has strong partisan overtones. Fortunately, some of that did not make it through the House. The Senate pushed it harder this year than the House did.
Yeah, now that wasn't review of legislative agency rules. That was pure.
That's exactly right.
legislation. You're right. You're right about that.
Larry D. Kump, delegate, our guest here on the program. Excuse me. Larry, from a practical standpoint, you mentioned that the State Board of Education has become more responsive since all of this has begun. So let's just take an assumption that this law stands.
Okay.
Let's say it's constitutional after all.
Okay.
All right. In practicality, what does this now give the legislature the power to do in regards to education in the state of West Virginia that it didn't have power to do previously?
If the law stands, it gives the legislature the authority to do the same thing it does with almost every other state agency. When they pass a law and the Department of Education implements rules with that law, the legislature has authority now to look at it and say, are those rules in compliance with what we've passed? In past circumstances, they have not had that authority. And the rules under the State Department of Education are literally several volumes thick.
Does it change at all the way the legislature can fund education in the state?
No, it does not. So that's the other angle that the legislature has. If the legislature gets really upset with what the Department of Education is, regardless of what the rules is, they can say, okay, we're just not going to fund it.
You can or cannot with this new law?
You can, and you can with or without this new law. The legislature does have discretion as to what they fund.
Well, hold on a second, Bill. Even without this law in place, you could still do that today?
That's right.
Regardless of the funding formulas that are in place?
Right, but they'd have to change the funding formula.
So in theory, could you right now say, we don't like the way education is in this state, we're providing $0 until we do a ground-up study?
In theory, you could.
Interesting. Bill?
Yeah, Larry, I believe the new law says that the legislators have the authority to look at every policy from the State Board of Education, not only those new policies, but the old policies.
That's right, same as with every other state agency.
Are the particular body of rules, excuse me, that this legislation is targeting?
No. It is the legislature's prerogative, with the exception of the Department of Education, whenever an agency passes rules or promulgates rules to implement legislation, to look at those rules to see whether or not they're in compliance with the law that the legislature passed. Currently, until this law was passed by the legislature, which is going to be still under court review, the legislature did not have that authority to do the same thing with the Department of Education.
Any idea why the Constitution was written that way?
Beats the hell out of me. I wasn't around then.
Okay. Somebody must have stepped up to defend the status quo.
Somebody must have come up to defend the status quo. And it's interesting, in our Constitution, one of the constitutional officers in the is the Secretary of Education. So evidently the framers of the Constitution thought the Department of Education was real important, and evidently they thought it was important enough, the way the law has been interpreted, to say the legislature keep hands off as far as reviewing their rules.
Do you have a sense of what the legislature will review first under this? What they're hungry to review first?
Well, what will happen? I don't think. This is just my guess. They're not going to go back and look at past rules, but any rule from this point forward that the Department of Education promulgates as a result of legislative fiat, they're going to say, like with every other agency, it's going to go through the Rules Committee and then the Government Organization Committee to say, okay, is this in compliance with what we wanted the law to do? So it'll be going forward, not going backwards. And it may be that as with other agency, they'll look at it and they'll say, okay, that's fine.
Why is it, Larry, you've invoked a couple so times that the only agency within the state government that does not have that oversight is the Department of Education. Why is that a compelling argument?
Because every other agency has that oversight.
But why is that a compelling argument?
Because what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Why?
consistency, and I think it's also a good process for whenever a law is passed, whenever an agency promulgates regulations, it's a good process for the legislature to make sure that those regulations are in compliance with the intent of the law.
But that should be the role of the governor. There are governor's agencies, and the governor knows what's the law, and the governor should have that responsibility. Why should the legislature, just because history and culture is imposed upon this, why are restricted by it? Why the Department of Education?
Other states use the governor. Other states use the Attorney General. State of West Virginia, for as long as I can remember, has had that go through the legislative review.
Yeah, but you've told me what is happening. You haven't told me the advantage of it.
The advantage of it is that any agency regulation should be in compliance with legislative law, and
Yes.
that's the reason, and that's the whole reason, end all and be all, for legislative oversight over agency rules.
And I would think in the case of education in particular, you want an agency to reflect the preferences of the communities, and the most direct communication with communities is through the legislature, not through the State Board of Education.
Well, the other issue is, and this is somewhat tangential, the education board is not elected by the people. They're appointed by the governor, and the secretary, or not appointed by the governor. The governor appoints. Yeah, the governor appoints them, and the secretary of the Department of Education is appointed by the board. So they are divorced from the people.
Well, and they're there for 9-year terms.
9-year terms.
Which is a great way to ossify an organization. I mean,
Right.
9 years, my goodness.
Right. That's a long time.
I suspect that timing is meant to outlast a two-term governor. Is my
That's
thought
my
process.
suspicion as well.
Larry,
and
I've
they
been
are
texting.
staggered. They are staggered,
Yes.
so you don't have all at once.
I've been texting back and forth with Mike Hornby, and he said that the funding for education is set by the funding formula. The legislature does not have the authority to restrict funding for education, either under the old laws or this current new bill, which gives oversight to the
No, but
legislature.
the legislature can change the funding formula
By what means?
by legislation.
And
And that's one of the things that the legislature is going to be looking at. They're going to be looking at the funding formula. There's some arguments that the funding formula has not been tweaked for quite a while, and it is not fair.
well, there certainly has been a lot of agreement with that from locally, at least. Anyway,
Yeah.
it seems to me that if your local citizenry wants to supplementally fund education, you shouldn't be punished for that at the state level.
Well, and the big argument in part of the growth counties,
Especially when your growth counties are kicking most of the money in.
such as Berkeley County. Berkeley County's argument is that we're being shortchanged with the funding formula.
Sure.
Rob, I have a tendency to think of some of the very tail end of a discussion. I'm doing it again right now.
Okay.
Isn't this going to become? Hasn't the State Board of Education filed suit, or has not some organizations filed suit? Will this not be resolved in the courts?
What are you asking to be resolved?
I'm talking about the legitimacy of this, the legislative oversight.
Yeah, I think it would be resolved in courts.
Because it has not been a constitution. Was not a constitutional change.
Right.
Well, the state needs to do something about
Right,
education, Larry, and I know there's been a lot of complaining about this bill amongst some folks, but I would say that at least the legislature is making an attempt to do something in regards to education in the state.
Well, and that was the argument for the people that voted for this bill, and I agree with the argument that there's a need of the oversight. My argument is procedurally it was reckless and feckless to do it that way.
Did you vote for the bill?
Huh?
Did you vote for the bill?
No, I did not vote for the bill. I got up and I spoke on behalf of the merits of what they wanted to do, but voted against the bill. And my argument was, and still is, that the most proper way to do that is to put in another constitutional amendment to clarify that we had oversight.
Do you recall how many others voted against the bill?
I have that right here. 32 voted against it. 66 voted for it. Keep in mind, there's only 9 Democrats, so there was a good number of Republicans that didn't like the bill either.
Any locally out of the Eastern Panhandle besides you who voted against it?
Oh, let's look here. It was me. I'm one of them. Nope, I'm the only one locally. There were some committee chairmen, the Republican, that voted against it, and then the Senate version was even closer.
If Anders did not vote against it, Chris Anders, I wonder if he voted for it.
He did vote for it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
If he felt, because he's very strong on constitutional.
Yeah, but I understand the dilemma. On the one hand, gee, is it constitutional or not? And on the other hand, but we want the oversight. So I guess he went. You'll have to ask him, but I guess he wanted the oversight.
Yeah. Larry, thank you for coming in.
I appreciate it.
Good to see you again.
Better be seen and viewed.
Some say.
Some say. Not all.